We'll hold off a bit. There he is. All right.
Madam Clerk, so I will be in the council chambers for the meeting. I'm going to take this work session in my office for those up there to know about. Madam Clerk, could you please read the roll?
Mr. Bozen?
Here.
Mr. Amos?
Here.
Mr. Morrissey?
Here.
Mrs. Klein?
Here.
Mr. Foyce?
Here.
Mr. Greider?
Here.
Mrs. Jewin?
Here. Except I don't know what happened. I just got lost. I got kicked out.
Well, even if you just do a motion to approve the agenda.
Okay, hold
Motion
on.
to approve the agenda as proposed. Second.
Motion's been made with a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'm back.
We have an agenda. First item on the agenda is the submission of Ward 3 Council Member, Mr. Pat Morrissey. Mr. Morrissey.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I guess we'll be addressing you as the chair during this meeting. Is that correct?
Yes. He's the chair of it.
Sure.
Okay. There are 6 items on this segment of the work session, and I think this work session goes till, if I'm not mistaken, from 3:40 to 4:40. Is that correct, Kelly?
That is correct.
Okay, and what I would ask is that the number 2 on there, which is dealing with the police insignia, that be just moved to the regular meeting where it's on the regular council agenda, if that's okay with the rest of the council.
So do you want
Wait a minute. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
That's part of the work session that we've all come here to listen to and to take part in. It's supposed to be hammered out here. It's not supposed to just appear on an agenda without a work session.
It was just, okay. So last week, it was discussed who wants to push this on till then. And it was. So right now, Mr. Morrissey, are you wanting this agenda item was already on the council meeting. You want another one?
No, I'm asking that we move that so that we move along that discussion to the regular agenda where it is set for discussion and a vote. I don't see why we need to discuss it twice when there's not going to be any public input in this work session on that, and that we can move that as it is written and part of the main agenda. So I am basically saying that number 2, I want to do number 1, number 3, and see if we can get through those 2. In other words, change that order around, leaving number 2 to the regular agenda for the sake of timeliness, Mr. Mayor.
Mr.
Okay.
Mayor?
So the items that are placed on here, the 6 items, are the items you placed on there to discuss. So
Correct.
If you don't want to talk about that, let's just keep moving, but let's go through
Mr.
on
Mayor?
here.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, I will start with number 1.
On there.
Mr. Mayor?
Number 1, Mr.
Mr. Mayor?
Klein,
Are you saying we're not going to have number 2? We're not going to have a workshop session for that where we find out why a person brought it forward, what data they used, what information they have pertaining to it, whether or not they ever spoke to the police department? You mean to tell me that we're going to silence this?
okay, I get where, did you take a look at the agenda today?
Yes.
The agenda has this on there. So the timeliness of this being talked about in a work session, which it was discussed during the last council meeting, where there was a consensus of council members that want to move, so the public discussion on this will be at 5:30. And at that time, we're going to ask the city council members, instead of making this that's already on the agenda, the regular council agenda, we're going to ask that that can be expedited so we won't keep people waiting here and that people could have an opportunity.
Mr. Mayor, that was never made public last week. That just came up. So I think we have to honor what we have put in print here. We have announced this to the public. The public is here. They have a right to hear all these things. And you know what? Maybe they have a right to think about it then, dissect it then, come back to the main meeting and make more salient points.
Yeah, just so the audience know, while everybody's clapping, during work sessions, if you want to talk about number 2, you can. I'm making a correlation and asking Mr. Morrissey, is he trying to add a separate motion to the council meeting because this is already on the council agenda? So if you want to talk about number 2, talk about number 2. But right now, this is what Mr. Morrissey placed on the work session to talk about. If you want to talk about it, fine. He has the floor first. You can come back next. Mr. Morrissey.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I believe as the person that's bringing these forward, I have a right as a member of this deliberative body to discuss these in the manner in which I wish to discuss and have council input on them. So that's all I'm doing, Mr. Mayor. And so I do want to begin, because we've already lost 7 minutes of time, on number 1. And it is referred to as the Waterloo Human Safety and Justice Ordinance. Now, the question may be asked, what is this for? I mean, why bring this now? Well, in the aftermath of the killing, the murdering of George Floyd, there has been an outcry from various communities within communities about there needs to be change. Okay. and so a few of us on council wanted to sit down, and we did sit down, and we talked about what we felt we should be looking at. In the first part of June, I had presented a prepared statement, and I referred to it as trouble every day. And in that, I had challenged the city council to deal with issues within our own community and to deal with them, first of all, by discussing them. And I listed 12 different items in there. And this number 1 here, Mr. Mayor, is the result of one of those points, but it includes several of the things that were discussed at that point in time, as you would see, and anybody would see if they read. This is 9 pages, as referred to again as the Waterloo Human Safety and Justice Ordinance. Now, I didn't think of all this on my own. What I did was I took time in developing this from the first part of June until handing these 9 pages as well as my ordinance prepared on the Racial Equity and Social Justice Toolkit to City Attorney Peterson last Tuesday at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so that it could get on the agenda for this week, and so these are on the agenda, 1 through 6. There's 4 resolutions, and there are 2 ordinances. One of the resolutions, Councilman Greider last week had already asked that it be put on the agenda for this week, and that was honored by City Clerk Kelly Felkley, with putting, I think it's agenda item number 8, or maybe number 9, and that deals with the insignia on the side of police vehicles as well as on their uniforms and other equipment. So this Waterloo Human Safety and Justice Ordinance I had taken and I pretty much mirrored what is the Community Safety Act, Community Policing Safety Act for the city of Providence, Rhode Island, Mr. Mayor. And I've contacted and had phone conversations with Providence, Rhode Island as recently as Friday of last week regarding their ordinance, and I appreciated what they had there. I had gone through that and used that as a template for what you see in front of you here with changes that are in there that meet what that trouble every day statement and what I'd heard around the country needed to be addressed. And so I bring that to City Council today. I made sure it was on as an attachment as part of our work session today so that the City Council had enough time to look at it and they could consider this. And I know, Mr. Mayor, that you have an ordinance that you have on the regular agenda today for police regulations, police ordinance, and what this Waterloo Human Safety and Justice Ordinance, I believe, would complement your ordinance and it would further specify things within your ordinance. So I hope that the council has read this, and if they have any questions or points of discussion, I don't think that I need to go over it page by page and read it page by page for my fellow council people, but I leave it open for discussion, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor? Mr. Mayor?
Oh, sorry about that. Mrs. Jewin.
I would, and I have read all of it, appreciate the time that Mr. Morrissey put in it, but I would like to hear from our police chief what his response to this proposal is.
Thank you, Ms. Juwan. I appreciate your question. Mayor and members of City Council, I think that I need to be given the opportunity to work through the processes and plans that I put forth in the various, or I should say 2 times that I've spoke to you about innovations and changes within the police department. I think that absent being allowed to make whatever changes I deem necessary within the department seems, for lack of a better way of putting it, a bit post haste. We've gotten through a pretty tremendous time in policing and across our country. Our city performed marvelously through those protests and through the exchange of ideals. You had people from both sides of the fence that argued but did not fight. You had people that did not tear this community apart. You had police officers, moreover, that kept this community together and walked with protesters. And yet now, after this has all been done, after our community has proven ourselves to be one that can work together, we are broaching a topic that can separate our community. I think that much of this work needed to be done up front. We've committed ourselves to making changes and doing the things necessary. Council has a responsibility to their citizens. I have a responsibility to the citizens, the city government, and my officers. And I, representing all of those entities, want to be given a chance to make sure you're judging the content and the character of the people that wear this uniform more so than just looking at their badge, looking at their patch, or thinking or supposing that there is something aberrant about an officer because of the way they look? Are we not now saying that we're judging officers by the same standard we do not want to be judged by? And I think that's a problem. I think that it's even more of a problem when this is brought up during a time that I think we've developed some good community relations, and I think conversations needed to be had. I have had conversations with people. I asked for submissions from folks that were retirees. I've asked for submissions from members of the general public, and we got that. And we got good and vibrant discussion over those topics online. I think that to ignore any particular aspect of an opinion, wherever that opinion comes from, whether it's from a small segment of the community or a large segment of the community, is wrong. I think that you need to allow us to move forward, to do a real survey and get the pulse of the entire community before we make any decisions about what we think people want as far as policing is concerned in this city. I was brought in to be the subject matter expert for the police department, and I'd like to be able to act as such.
So, Chief, with regards to the question that Ms. Juwan asked also, have you even had the time to look at the Waterloo Human Safety and Justice Ordinance yet? And all the, I think it's 9 pages.
Well, much like I think some that I provided the plethora of notes and changes for this department I have been inundated with looking at policy, looking at procedure, look at the way we do business on a day-to-day basis, and making changes to the way we conduct ourselves and the way we do business. Our folks have worked very hard and are under a lot of stress, just like police officers are across the country, just like communities are across the country that have been treated disparately. And again, I think more time needs to be dedicated to actually looking at what I put forth, seeing whether these points that are being brought out here in a belated manner have been addressed by what I put out and put forward. I gave a tremendous amount of information in a very comprehensive document out that addressed many of these issues. And I'd like to be able to have the chance to see how the community responds as a whole to these issues before we make some changes or we make rash changes that will tear this community apart.
All right.
Mayor.
Council, anyone else on first
Mr. Mayor.
question? Yes, sir.
Yes. Mr. Mayor, I feel the need to weigh in on this because the citizens out there that are clapping and everything need to understand how this process happened, what happened here. You know, we had all of those things going on around the country behind George Floyd and everything. And Councilman Morrissey gave me a call. And he asked me, you know, if I thought that he would be able to help. And what he did was he read me all of those things that he actually had in his mind. And what my reply to him was, well, we need to, as a council, discuss these things. There's nothing in any of the things that Councilman Morrissey is bringing forward that are etched in stone. But I firmly believe that we as a council, with the things that are going on, if we don't talk about these things, whether they happen or not, I feel like we're being derelict as far as the citizens of Waterloo. Because these things are out there, they are happening. You know, I had a conversation with the chief. I'm more than able and willing to let him do his thing, you know, from that standpoint. But these issues are things that are impacting people around this country. They're impacting people in our community. And I know good and well, if we as a council talk about these things behind closed doors, there would be heck to pay. So what we're doing is we are bringing this out to the community, to everyone, to know that we are talking about these things, and we are trying to make sure that this community doesn't have those issues. I know there are a lot of things in Councilman Morrissey's stuff that may not even be able to be done. That was one of the reasons why it was, we need to get this to the city council. I wasn't expecting to have to address this stuff today. My thought was, we would get it to the city attorney, find out what was legal and what we couldn't include, then we would bring that forward for discussion. Because that is the way that I feel like we should be doing things. We don't want anything to be hid from the public. And if we were discussing these things behind closed doors or something like that, the public would not like it. So this is about transparency for me. This is about issues that were brought forward that are a concern that we need to discuss as a body. So that for me is what we're doing. None of this stuff is necessarily going to happen. And the calls that I have been receiving, people already have them in ordinances and resolutions and things like that. That is not the case. So people in the public understand that is not what we are doing at this point in time. We are trying to be transparent. We are trying to give you information and things that we are looking at to try and make sure that Waterloo is what it needs to be.
All right, thank you. Any other questions on
Mayor?
the first one?
Mr. Mayor?
Ms. Jewin?
I would just say I appreciate Mr. Amos's comments, and I agree with him to the extent that I think we first need to give our police chief the opportunity to read through them, to make sure he has a chance to study them. We hired him to develop our policies, and I think he's only been on the job a couple months. I think we need to give him more time. If there's more policies he thinks he needs to recommend or adopt, have him look through here. Maybe there's going to be an idea in Mr. Morrissey's proposal that he likes and would like to adopt. But give our police chief a chance to go through them, adopt or recommend the ones that he thinks work for our police department. And then after that, when he says, yep, I've developed all the policies that I think are necessary, then if there are still a few factors that some of the council members think need to be added, we can address them now. But like I said, he's only been here 2 months. We haven't given him a chance, and he's the person that we hired to address policies. So I think it's premature to address them at this point.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Greider?
I firmly understand what Chief Fitzgerald is saying. I firmly understand what Ms. Jewin is saying. And I get that. And I certainly don't want to get ahead of anyone. But I also know that some of the things that we have discussed transcend any of our time on this council. For some of us, it transcends our whole lifetime. And I think we do have to have these conversations in public. I think that they need to be had. I think they need to be had when the time comes for these questions to be asked. And these questions have been asked by members of the community. So I don't think that we can say that these things were pulled out of the air willy-nilly to advance a political agenda that I don't believe in, even though I've been accused of it. But some of these things, we have a responsibility as a lawmaking body to think about the laws that we have. And of course, I want to have conversations with the police chief about these types of things. But I would also echo my colleague from Ward 4 that none of these things are set in stone. We are willing to have these conversations, and that these things may, and certainly in some cases, I'm sure, should change. But change is hard, and these questions have been asked. And so I think it's time to have this conversation in a public forum so that we can hear from people. That's important because, yes, this summer was George Floyd, but a few years ago, it was Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown. So we need to have these questions, and we need to ask them because they have been asked before. So I think having a transparent, open conversation with the community is a positive thing. And again, none of these things are preordained or certain. We can certainly hear from people, but I am always going to err on the cleansing light of day when talking about policy.
Mr. Mayor,
Mrs. Klein. Mrs. Klein?
yeah, I heard you. Here's the thing. We hire this gentleman who has a PhD in what he does. He came highly recommended from across the country. He knows what he's doing. And amateurs up here who have no training in police work, no experience with police work, who have relied on the police heavily in the past, are cutting our police chief off at the knees. They are. They blindsided him with this. They didn't go in and sit down and have a conversation. They're too busy hiding behind their typewriters, typing all this junk up. They go and they look at other states.
Mr. Mayor, point of order.
Terrible things have happened. This is Waterloo. We need people to represent Waterloo. And before he even began his job, Chief Fitzgerald came that weekend when tempers were high and joined in and defused all of it. And we have to honor that, and we have to honor him and allow him to do his job without us getting involved like that.
Mrs. Klein, regardless of where we stand at on this issue, let's keep the name calling out of the conversation.
We are amateurs in that regard, and I include myself.
Well, you speak for yourself. You speak for yourself. Because you don't speak for me. I was out in the streets at 2:00 in the morning, working with people, talking to people, working with the police. So when you put up a blanket statement, stick to whoever you're talking about. But I've been in here. I just worked to get over $250,000 for law enforcement. So watch what you're saying to people. Stop disrespecting people, just like you want me to do the same.
Stop disrespecting me right now. Stop it. I have a right to my opinion. None of these council people
you have your right
in
to
this.
your opinion, but you don't have the right to disrespect me or anyone else.
No one disrespects anyone who's doing the job correctly.
Mr. Mayor, point of order.
Oh, man.
Listen. Let me just say something real quick. Because many people are sitting on different sides of this particular issue. And many people feel a certain way about this. But the fact of the matter is Mr. Morrissey allowed to put something on as a work session, just like everyone else has? He is allowed that. If we can keep the conversation on the issues that are listed here and debate or have a conversation about the policy, I think we would be better served. So are there any other questions with regards to the policy?
So just number 1, correct?
Yeah. Now, what I'm going to ask, we have a work session that's starting at 4:40. I am going to ask that be moved next week because we're going to spend our time talking about these. And if it is listed on here as number 2 as well, to talk about this insignia, even though before this was submitted knew that it was on the agenda, then we're going to come back and talk about number 2. Mr. Morrissey, can you please lead us through the 6 items that you have here so that we can have some conversation about it and stick to the issues?
Mr. Mayor, I will, and that's what I'm attempting to do. I'm really not finished with number 1 because I firmly believe that number 1, first of all, when I handed these into the city attorney and then to Kelly Felkley, I had sent you an email requesting a meeting with you and the chief with Jonathan, myself, and Jerome. And that occurred Wednesday of last week. And I have even called, left messages for you, Mr. Mayor. So for somebody to in any way infer or say that I have not tried to sit down and talk with you and the chief about this would not be correct, when in fact I did Wednesday and Thursday and Friday of last week. So I'd like to put that to rest. I have the highest regard for Chief Fitzgerald, even though I've not had a chance to sit down and talk to him face to face. I understand what he is doing and trying to do, and I respect that. What I am saying in this number one is that it is some ideas and it's some proposals that I would have, because we as the city council are the deliberative legislative body for the city of Waterloo. And we approve. We can create policies. We don't make up the programs. We can suggest programs, but we don't do that. But we are policymakers, Mr. Mayor. And that's what this is. In conjunction with Chief Fitzgerald, great. But I think there needs to be that merging, that respectful merging. And I so deeply hope that we can get that done with civil conversation. So if I could, I'm going to go through this Waterloo Human Safety and Justice Ordinance, and I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to discuss the different parts of it. Number one.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Morrissey?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Are you planning on getting through all of these so where the rest of the council can have some input?
I hope so. I hope so. I'm going to go as fast as I can, Mr. Mayor. Okay? Or am I on? Are you froze or what?
I don't want to interrupt the time because this was supposed to be a public discussion.
Okay, so the first section of this deals with definitions, terms, and that goes A1 through A10. Okay, the next section is a prohibition on racial and other forms of discriminatory profiling. The next one is how our law enforcement documents, and that's an accountability thing. The next thing has to do with traffic stops or pretextual stops.
Mr. Morrissey, can I ask a question on that part, or do you want to wait till the end of section?
Yeah, let me, if you would, Ms.
Sure.
Please let him get through one of these sections, and then we'll have discussion, Ms. June.
Okay.
And that next one is the traffic stops and the pretextual stops, and what that all means and what's entailed in that, and the responsibilities of our public servants, the police officers involved, law enforcement officers involved. Next one is it's a section on searches, 1 and 2 in that. Next one deals with surveillance and privacy, and that's 1 through 7. The next is a section on language access for limited English proficient individuals, explains what that is and what's entailed in that. Next is H, and is collaboration with other law enforcement agencies, and that is 1 through 6. Next is accountability and enforcement, and that is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 parts to that section. Next is I, which is a single statement by itself. K is a single statement by itself, dealing with appropriate funding to implement provisions. Because I've heard people say that I'm in favor of defunding the police. I mean, unbelievable. I've been on council 6.5 years. I've supported public safety the entire time I was on city council. So I think we need to have a discussion about what that means and if any of it's pertinent in the city of Waterloo. Next one is L, and that is a report back to the city council from the chief of police as well as the chair of the Commission on Human Rights. Next is M, the use of force by the Waterloo Police Department and interactions with the public. Next deals with possession of marijuana and its priority by the police department. Next is O, all members of PD being required to read this, understand it, and that. And the final clause is a severability clause, which basically says that if any section of this is declared by a court invalid, it doesn't affect the rest of it, though. And then the last thing is just a section 2 dealing with when the ordinance takes effect. So, as you can see, Mr. Mayor, there was time, effort. I consider myself, and always have since I've been involved in the careers I've been involved with, as somebody who is professional, civil, and disciplined in different aspects of what I get involved in. And this is one of those aspects, Mr. Mayor. So with that summary, I open that up back to the council if they have any questions about.
Questions on the on Mr. Morrissey's proposed, his review right now. Any questions on this, Ms. Jewin? I think you were.
I have several, Mr. Mayor.
Yes,
if I can ask all of them.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My first one has to do with section D, and it's number 3, and I just maybe don't understand it. It says, no passenger of a motor vehicle shall be requested to provide identification or any other documentation when the motor vehicle has been stopped solely for a traffic violation. I don't understand. Are you saying that you wouldn't ask them for their driver's license if they're being stopped for speeding?
This is a passenger, Councilman Jewin. It's not the driver.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. I skipped right over that. My fault. Thank you.
That's okay.
My fault. Okay. Let me then go to, and this one is kind of broad, so all of section, what section is it in? It has to do on page 7. It's all in section, I guess, I, accountability and enforcement. When we start with, in number 4, talking about complaints, any place the Waterloo Human Rights Commission is, so maybe I'll just make it more general. I don't understand how we're infusing their authority into police department actions, even to the point that they can deny budget deliberations or participate in those. I think that's a reach, that they're authorized to review the collective bargaining agreements, that they're authorized to accept and receive complaints. I just don't understand why we're inserting the Waterloo Human Rights into this, and my opinion is that's beyond their scope. So I could read each one to you, Pat, but can you just answer why you're inserting their responsibilities here?
Well, I would respond, Councilwoman Jewin. Is the Human Rights Commission, do they have enforcement criteria with them?
With the police department?
No. Are they also involved with enforcement of human rights issues?
Yes.
And is this not a human rights ordinance that I'm proposing?
Perhaps, but I think it needs to be within the police department. They do their own investigations, their own review, set up their own budget knowing their needs. I don't think it's something that the Human Rights Commission has a role in. No.
Well, I totally disagree with you,
Okay.
Councilman Jewin, because I
We
believe
can agree to disagree.
well, human rights is part of what the police department is involved in. And if there are complaints or there are issues, that would come up, and I would hope that there never would be. But if they would, the place that it goes to, other than the police department for internal kinds of discussions and decisions, it needs to go to the Human Rights Commission that we have established and we have to have in a town our size. So
Yeah,
I
I
am making
understand.
use, let me finish.
Okay.
When I read through the Community Policing Safety Act, or Community Safety Act in community policing for the city of Providence, Rhode Island, one of the things that struck me was that they did not make use of their Human Rights Commission. What they did was they established an external review authority, which would be similar to like setting up a civilian advisory board. And the problem that has occurred is that external review authority, according to my contact with them last week, has lacked teeth in their recommendations in that. This does not in any way give the Waterloo Commission on Human Rights any authority to defund anything. What it does is it gives them the authority in private closed sessions in discussing human rights violations that might be occurring by violating this, by any violation of this. It gives them the opportunity as a citizen advisory, but they're a commission appointed by the mayor that are made up of citizens that meet racial, ethnic, gender criteria to be on that board, for them to take a look at those things and make recommendations back. It doesn't give the Waterloo Commission on Human Rights the authority that the council would have in making decisions, but it does give them the right and the authority to go ahead, look at those, and to make recommendations based on their roles in the Human Rights Commission.
Okay, let me just respond that I know the police chief is in the midst of establishing the citizen review committees or advisory committees or whatever they all agree to. I think we need to give the police chief the opportunity to establish those committees. I do not think it's the role of the Human Rights Commission. But again, we agree to disagree. My final objection or concern is in number N, where it's possession of marijuana. I think that's a state-controlled issue, is it not, Mr. Morrissey? And we have no role in that?
This has nothing to do with state law, Sharon.
But the state sets the amount of marijuana, whether it's legal or not legal to carry marijuana.
That's not what N says, Sharon.
Pardon?
That's not what N says. Read it again, please.
The possession of small quantities of marijuana or the use of same shall only be enforced at the lowest priority.
Yes.
So, okay, you tell me what that means then. The
That
smallest
means that-
quantity, we won't get them if they have a certain amount or
That
less?
means that it is addressed at the lowest priority level. It's still addressed.
Lowest
not-
priority internally to the police department, you mean? That it's
As
the
far
police
as
department?
enforcement of it.
Okay, so it becomes the police department's lowest priority.
Correct. It doesn't decriminalize, it doesn't legalize, it puts it at the lowest priority.
Okay.
Because studies have shown, again, the racial disparity in that. Councilwoman June.
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Mayor.
you. That's all my questions.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Bozen.
Thank you, sir. I've gone through everything that Councilman Morrissey submitted, and personally, I mean, I understand he put a lot of work into this, but I got to tell you, Providence, Rhode Island, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon is not Waterloo, Iowa, and I understand every there's complexities in every city that need to be addressed differently. I highlighted over half of this first section. I'm curious if our city attorney or even our county attorney had gone through this and found out what's lawful, what we can do, what we can't do. Some of these items that Providence has doesn't pertain to us. We don't even have federal identification numbers, as far as I know, that need to be plainly displayed on their uniform. So getting back to what Councilwoman Jewin said on page 7, number 4, the Waterloo Police Chief shall prepare and make available the City of Waterloo's website as well as to the Human Rights Commission public semi-annual report. The compilation of this data collected pursuant to this subsection provided a minimum statistic description of individual stops, results of stops analyzed by race, ethnicity, gender, and age perceived by the law enforcement officer initiating the stop. Then under number 5, it says the Waterloo Human Rights Commission, upon review of all data described in the section I-4, may recommend a reallocation of specified amounts of city funding to the Waterloo Police Department budget to other community public services, including human services, municipal leisure services, housing incentives, youth programming, employment opportunities, social and mental health. I have strong opinions and disagreements with this. I don't believe that the Human Rights Commission should have an opportunity to be part of what I would consider defunding or reallocation of funding out of the Waterloo Police Department's budget. And I understand, I talked to Mr. Morrissey about it, and I understand that it would take 4 council votes to reallocate that funding, but based on the next election, there's 4 council votes. Now on page 8, number 8, it says the Waterloo Human Rights Commission is authorized to receive copies of all Waterloo Police Department internal affairs investigations involving any form of misconduct by a law enforcement officer on or off duty and not limited to the violations of this ordinance. Respective disciplinary measures shall not be released to the public. How and why in this world would we release an internal affairs investigation that doesn't pertain to something that pertains to this ordinance to the Human Rights Commission that doesn't involve any violation of human rights? There's so many things in this that I have questions on. Like I say, I have over half of it highlighted, and we wouldn't even get through this first section if I discussed it. That's all I have right now, sir.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Amos.
Yeah, Councilman Morrissey and I have had a conversation about the Waterloo Human Rights Commission. A lot of you know I chaired it for a while as far as working with Abraham, David Meeks. And one of the things that the commission did do was look at exactly the things that Councilman Morrissey wants to do. And we found that anything that had to do with the Waterloo Human Rights Commission and the Waterloo Police Department, those things the Human Rights Commission could not investigate. Those things could be investigated, but it was not the Waterloo Human Rights Commission that would do those investigations. They had to forward all of this information onto the state, and it was simply nothing more than it would give the appearance of conflict of interest if the Human Rights Commission for the city of Waterloo was investigating the Waterloo Police Department. And I know for a fact, if you check with Abraham Funches, he carries a law badge. He is a part of that system. And that, for me, and that's one of the reasons why the councilman and I had a discussion about getting the city attorney involved, getting his opinion on a lot of this stuff. And as far as I know, we don't have an opinion yet from the city attorney for a lot of this stuff. So like I said, none of this stuff is etched in stone. This is a discussion, finding out what we can and cannot do. So for me, like I say, the Waterloo Human Rights Commission, Councilman Morrissey knows my feelings on it. I don't think that that should be a part of this document, but like I said, we're hearing from the city attorney, and I will follow whatever that city attorney says because he does work for us.
Anything else before we move to
Mr.
the next
Mayor.
number?
Mr. Mayor, if I may, On page 4 and 5, it talks about photographing individuals under the age of 18 years, that we will no longer be allowed to photograph any of them who are arrested for a crime. Does that include murder? Does that include burning down a building, say City Hall? I mean, at what point? 17 years old and you cannot photograph them for evidence? You can't photograph them at all? I don't understand this. A person who is arrested of a crime should be photographed. Also, I have another section of this, which is my colleague, Mr. Morrissey, is always so careful to pressure us about details and to have everything refined and defined when we come to the council. And yet, low priority is the way you describe the marijuana arrests. That's just, it's vague. It's absolutely like gossamer. You can't get your arms around it. You're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't. And some of these I was looking at actually inserts race in the rules by which our police will have to follow. It's like you can't describe anyone according to their ethnicity. You can't describe anyone according to their race. So if you're mugged by, let's describe this person, a short, slightly overweight, white-haired, white woman who sits on the city council, you can't describe that at all. That is nonsense. Do you see how it borders on a circus?
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Morrissey.
well, first of all, I would ask the council person from Ward 1 to look at the top of page 5 when it deals with photographing people under 18. All that she needs to do is read to see that what she said is totally incorrect.
It says on the top of page.
And I cannot force anybody to read information that is right in front of their face, but I would encourage her to please go ahead and do that.
This is very confusing paper because in the one section you say it's prohibited, and in the other,
I have
except
the
now,
floor,
except
Mr.
then,
Mayor.
except maybe.
Mr. Mayor,
And also,
I have the floor,
a lot
I
of this stuff is touched on by our police
point of
chiefs
order.
paper.
Can I
Did you read
can I-
that?
Can I ask council a question? We've been on number 1 for a lot of times, and I'm hearing we didn't, we did. Is it possible? I know Jonathan, Mr. Greider, I know you have some comments, but we've been stuck at number 1, and there's about 5 other ones. I don't necessarily know. There's a lot of language in there. The city attorney still has to go through these 7 or 8 pages. Is it possible to move to number 2? But I'll defer, Mr. Greider. It's your floor.
All I want to ask, all I would like to ask is, have we looked at, I know that Des Moines had looked at a resolution, an ordinance similar to this. I'm just curious because Providence, Rhode Island is a different place. So I'm just curious if we have looked at what Des Moines has done. Obviously, that's also a different place, but obviously sits within the same state law when we consider something like this. That was my only question.
Mr. Peterson, City Attorney Peterson, did we have some language? I think it was Mr. Greider. Are you meaning the non-biased policing language from Des Moines?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson, have we looked at that?
Yes, Your Honor. We have a copy of that. It's much more limited in scope, and as you indicated, it deals with bias in policing and use of force, as I understand it. But it's been at least a month since I've looked at that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Greider. We have some other items. Mr. Morris.
As long as I didn't know City Attorney Peterson was there, but I'd like to ask City Attorney Peterson if in your perusal through this 9-pager, if you have found anything that was blatantly illegal.
This document covers a lot of ground. But to answer your question, yes, I think on page 2, the documentation portion clearly violates Chapter 22 relating to open records. I have some concerns with regard to other aspects of it. It touches on, a new law that was passed, I think, 2 years ago, Iowa Code Section 825.4, where on page 6 it talks about not cooperating with other law enforcement agencies as it relates to immigration law, and I know it specifically exempts the Title 8 of the United States Code, Section 1373, but it also, I think, brushes up against the Iowa Code that was passed. I think on page 7, there are certain things that concern me with regard to the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, which Iowa has adopted at Iowa Code Chapter 80, capital F, that's 80F. So, there's a lot to digest here, but I do have some general concerns.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Mayor, if it's okay to move on, I would just suggest that we move this back and have another work session on it, maybe after City Attorney Peterson has a chance to look at it, the chief police has a chance to look at it, you do for discussion. If that's what my proposal is for item number 1, Mr. Mayor.
So let's go to the next items.
Okay, the next one that I'm bringing up is the ordinance establishing mandatory use of racial equity and social justice analysis in the city of Waterloo. It's a 1-page ordinance with language in it. I have tweaked it just a little bit in Section 3, and I can go over that, the change that I made there, but it incorporates as part of the language in here the 9-page racial equity social justice toolkit for policies, programs, and budgets as developed for use in the city of Waterloo by the Waterloo Commission on Human Rights and presented to us the first part of June of this year.
Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Morrissey, is this for the whole city or is this for the police department?
This is the whole city.
All right, Mrs.
This
June.
is the entire city structure, organization. And if I could, I'll just jump ahead into that Section 3 and the changes or the tweaking that I made there. And the proposal would be to have it read, all current policies, practice, programs, and budgets within each city department may be evaluated by each department using the Racial Equity Social Justice Toolkit or as seen necessary by the Waterloo Commission on Human Rights. And then B would read, all city departments shall evaluate proposed policies, practices, and programs and budgets using the Racial Equity Social Justice Toolkit and submit a report of that Racial Equity Social Justice Toolkit evaluation to the Waterloo Commission on Human Rights for comment and any further action or recommendations to the City Council.
All right. Mrs. Jewin?
Yeah, I've voiced this concern before. We've had a work session before on the toolkit, and at that time I asked, and you said, Mr. Mayor, that you would follow through with this. Before I could give any more consideration to this, I want Mr. Funches to come before the council and maybe take 3 examples on how this would work. How would it work with our budget? How would it work with a construction project? How would it work on a TIF project? My concern is it would paralyze all of our departments to the point that it would take a long time to even start implementing a project, and I don't I just don't agree with it. But if Mr. Funches would come to us and give us specific examples, not just highlights, but specifically how each project would go through this process. Because until that happens, I personally am not able to give any consideration to the toolkit.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Greider.
So, and I can't answer Council Member Juin's question specifically because I'm not Mr. Funches. But I do know that Iowa City has adopted something similar. And in my conversations sort of around this policy piece, the way they put it together, and this is just them and ours might be different, it was more of a like consideration and just a question that was asked on the forms as they sort of went through of like, how might this impact low income neighborhoods or this particular community? They did not, the person that I talked to in their planning and zoning board did not feel that it was just sort of like another question, just to make sure people are cognizant of this. Now, obviously, we might be different, and of course we're different because we're not Iowa City, but in my sort of separate conversations from this, that's how they had approached it. But I think that Mr. Funches should let us know in our context, because it is always important to hear the Waterloo context, but that's how someone else has done it who's nearer to us.
Mr. Mayor.
So am I. Yes, Mrs. Klein.
I remember when Mrs. Juin and I met with Mr. Funches to have coffee and discuss the details of this. And frankly, he didn't seem to understand the whole ramification of this sort of thing. And he admitted that he had taken it from another community. And I did not think he understood it completely because I kept asking questions like, for example, if we do a road overlay, does that proposal have to go before this racial toolkit committee, which is chosen by the Human Rights Commission, which is Mr. Funches? So, and he said yes. And then I thought, okay, do we have to? We're going to try and repair flooded areas of my ward next year and of many citizens in Waterloo. Does that have to go through this racial equity commission as well? Because we're tired of delays. And this is just another overlay of unelected government, in my opinion, as it stands now. And as Mr. Funches explained it to us, or didn't explain it to us, because he agreed that all those things would be involved. It would slow down Waterloo like a snail.
All right. Thank you, Mrs. Klein. So one of the things I think with this is whether or not it is done in full length or whether it's done the way Jonathan mentioned. I think when we're taking a look down the road to see if we're making good decisions or decisions that are taking a look at a holistic impact on certain parts of the community, I think having some type of question or looking at some of these things with the lens could possibly be of a benefit. And I'll give you one example. One of the greatest impacts that we've had to the city was when the highway first went through a portion of this community. It broke up neighborhoods, economic development, but it had a huge impact on. And so if we were able to say, hey, what type of long-range impact does this have on our community, and does it impact this or does it impact that? Looking at it through that lens, or Mrs. Klein, as you mentioned, some of the impacts with regards to what we're doing within our treatment plan to make sure that we're working on backups and prioritizing this and social justice. I think there are some parts and some pieces of this that would be really good for us to be able to look through that lens to make long-range decisions. How that's done, when it's done, like we have a CIP process. And during the CIP process, we highlight projects and all those things that we're going to do for the next year. And a lot of what is being expended, we've already already have done that through the CIP process. So maybe there's a way that we could mix in from what Jonathan said to the larger one to at least be able to look at some of the things we do with a critical lens to make sure that social justice, are we prioritizing getting some of those things done in some of those neighborhoods? Are we having disparate impact? So I think there are some pieces of this that we can use to be able to look at the decisions we make. So if it's okay, instead of just completely not doing it all, if we can continue to work on some of this and then bring something through to council, if that would be good, instead of just throwing it all away. Are there some parts that we can salvage and use for our long-term future? If council would allow me to work with Abraham to do that, please.
Mr. Mayor, just one follow-up. I'm looking at this screen and I see that we are very diverse. I'm reminded of our administrators and we are very diverse there as well. I just don't see why there is a prejudice against our honor, our integrity in doing what's right for this city. To bring in people who the public cannot elect, cannot touch, cannot throw out at the next election if they feel they're not being well served. To bring in that overlaying group makes me nervous, especially when we're talking about race here. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about economics, we're talking about race. And I see that we are doing very well on race. We really are. Waterloo's doing quite well.
Mr. Mayor.
Right. So I would probably say, Mrs. Klein, what I'm trying to say is that there's some pieces in here that will be valuable without isolating, but making sure that we could take a look with a critical lens to trying to make long-term decisions that's in the best interest of this community. So I understand what you're saying. I understand what the council members are saying. And this may be one where we all agree to disagree, but I do think there are some pieces in this, or the perspective that we take moving for our long-term future, that we can utilize. So whether it's this kit, or whether it is doing what Jonathan said Iowa City's doing, taking a critical look, I think there's some value in asking those questions up front. And that's just my personal opinion. And whether that's done through council ordinance, or whether that is just done with council communication, answering those questions, thinking about it, I think we need to do something. But anyone else before we move on to the next one?
Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Jewin and then Mr. Bozen. He had the finger up.
Oh. I would just say that I'm reinforcing what I said before. Yes, there might be parts of it, but Mr. Funchess, as Mrs. Klein said, we asked the questions. He was not able to give answers until such time that he can come before the council and give us specific examples of how this toolkit would make projects work. I can't consider it anymore. There might be great pieces of it, but I need to hear from Mr. Funchess how this policy would work.
All right. Mr. Bozen.
Thank you, sir. I'm just going to echo what Mrs. Jewin said, because I too would like to have Mr. Funchess come before the council and do a work session on this. And I also would like to echo what you said, because I truly believe this toolkit can be used for long-term projects and long-term things that the city is moving forward with, so that we make sure that we are following those guidelines, so we treat each neighborhood appropriately, and their rights and their wishes are configured into this, especially at the CIP time. But the rest of this, we are going to have we're a long ways from it, sir. I mean, we would never get through a council meeting. We'd have to start budgeting process and at the first of July to get through all of this. If everything we did had to be analyzed and pushed through the Human Rights Commission for this council to move forward. So I commend what you want to do. Let's get together. Let's look at the long-term and how we can make it better. I commend what Mr. Jewin is saying, that we need more answers, and we need Mr. Funches to step forward at a work session and lay all of this out so that we all are on the same page. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Number 4, Mr. Morrissey, if you can speedily take us through that so we can understand that.
Well, just to comment first, these proposals are being brought forward for any number of reasons. Racial equity and social justice is something that has been put on the back burner in the city of Waterloo for decades. It's gone by the wayside. And it's time that this council does something about it. But all that we're doing right here now is saying we got to hold off. This isn't good enough, or it's not what we want. Human justice, social justice, racial equity, based on all the racial disparity and the social justice disparity things that go on, are addressed and need to be addressed. And if this council wants to kick that can down the road like previous administrations have done, then you go ahead and do so. With that, item number...
What about some respect,
4?
Mr. Mayor? Mr. Mayor, I call
With
point
that,
of order.
item number 4.
That was
With that,
disrespectful.
item number 4. Excuse me, I have the floor.
I don't excuse you. That was out of order.
Ms. Klein, can I just say this? I think
Call him on it. You called me on it. Call him on it.
Can I finish what I'm going to say? I was going to say, I think he was telling me about kicking the can down the road. I just don't get caught up in that rhetoric. So that was the mayor kicking it down the road, not Mrs. Klein. That's what I heard. So to your point, I can take it, and it doesn't bother me. But Mr. Morrissey, please go ahead with number 4.
Yeah, item number 4 and 5 and 6. I'm going to ask if Jonathan Greider would lead that discussion.
So we will likely only have time, Mr. Mayor, for item number 4. So I've gotten a lot of emails. So I do want to clarify something for everyone. This is not facial recognition of like the police checking like the FBI data bank or like an Iowa statewide data bank for photos. What this is referring to is commercial grade facial recognition software. And there are 2 problems that have been coming to light about these particular types of software. One of them is that many of these companies, including one that recently came under some heat called Crossfire, would take people's photos, not just from government databases, which is certainly allowed, but they would utilize a tool known as scraping, which is if your photo showed up on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or any form of social media, or even if a company ended up taking your photo through their closed caption televisions that they just happen to have. Many types of this commercial grade software will find those photos, which goes well beyond sort of the scope of what past sort of facial recognition software has done. And that is, for me, and I can only speak for me, I feel that's concerning, because it is one thing for a police department to be able to find my photo from, the Iowa Department of Motor Vehicles. It's another thing for that software to be able to go into private social media accounts and other things that are connected to the internet and utilize those photos to find people. So that's one concern that I have with this type of software. The second problem with this particular type of software is that in studies that they've done at MIT and Harvard and UCLA, as well as private studies done through Google and IBM, both companies that have since disavowed doing facial recognition software, these programs are very they're very bad at recognizing people of color in the software. They have, on average, about a 33% failure rate in properly identifying a person of color. And in fact, they did, the U.S. House of Representatives had a hearing on this, and it misidentified several people of color who are members of Congress on the House Judiciary Committee as people who had a history of criminal background, which they were not the same people. And so that is also, as we get into sort of the surveillance level that we are just seeing in a modern world where everything can be digitized and photographed and videoed. And the other problem is that there is also a confirmation bias, so that police officers, because they see this software in studies that they've done, tend to believe the software even when compared to just sort of a normal, the police using their own sort of methods to recognize faces and match them up. So even when the facial recognition software was done, people still erred on the side of the software, which was wrong, as opposed to old methods. And so we are not currently using this type of software. It's very expensive. But the reason that I think this is something that we should get ahead of is because, one, I just have concerns about any level of government being able to scrape my photo from somewhere and use it for other purposes. That concerns me. The other concern is that it does impact people of color. And the other concern is, as these things get cheaper, they will be looked at as a viable option. And several companies that have started this are moving away from it. So this is why I want to have this conversation. And of course we can make changes. I don't want to suggest anything is set in stone, but there are big civil liberty concerns about this, in addition to the racial aspect that also comes with this type of software.
Mr. Mayor?
So, yes, ma'am.
I would like Chief Fitzgerald to weigh in on this. This has really piqued my curiosity, and I would like to see what his experience says about it.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Yes, Mr. Mayor and Council. Well, facial recognition software and the bias that Mr. Grider spoke of is absolutely scientifically proven to happen. However, good police departments and good investigations use it as what it's intended to be, and that is a good lead. You do not use technology to make your case altogether. You use a combination of that technology and investigations to put a case together. So having supervisors and other people reviewing the documentation and materials that need to be reviewed before we make an arrest, or before we move out to get an arrest warrant for someone is critical. I'd also say this, in countries where we have adopted things like, let's say slowing it down and de-escalating a situation, like Scotland, for example. The reason why Scotland and places like that haven't the same level of crime that we do here in the United States is just that, because they've used facial identification software packages to identify bombers, to identify people who have, to help identify, I should say, people who have actually done something wrong. And the citizens there, as well as myself and my family, when we visited those countries, felt rather safe. And since we knew we weren't doing anything illegal, we weren't feeling as if Big Brother was watching and using our face for anything other than just that. If there were a crime and we were to be privy or near where a crime happened, drawing that information to develop a suspect or develop a lead. I think we need to be very careful about slowing down the process of modernization in policing. We have police officers started using fingerprints, and they started using DNA, and they started using other types of evidence that we've become comfortable with. But now we are not comfortable with something that showed that, with its misuse, has prompted wrongful convictions. Again, we need to take a look at the investigators themselves. We need to take a look at their supervision, and we need to take a look at the policies and procedures we have in place to ensure that those type of misidentifications don't happen, not necessarily exclude the software as an option for our investigations.
So to Jonathan's point, there has been some problems and challenges with the software that's utilized.
Mr. Mayor, sorry, go ahead.
Do you take a holistic approach? That's what I'm trying to wonder. Is it just facial, or I know we don't have it yet, but how would you, if you had this, how would you utilize this to create a holistic approach to not just using that?
I think I spoke to it a little, Mayor. You know, again, it boils down to monitoring what investigations are taking shape in your jurisdiction, having supervisors involved in reviewing people's work, ensuring that what they're doing is legitimate and has been validated. And that's something that happens even now. When you have a match of any type, when you have a match of someone that a suspect has been picked out in a lineup, you have to verify and cross-verify that this is correct. This is the evolution of policing. This has happened. And if we said, hey, it's not really good to have a police officer in a police car, we wouldn't be riding around in police cars, would we? I mean, if we looked at things, that myopically and said, hey, this, it started out as being an idea that wasn't implemented well, but, other places are using it. They're doing a pretty good job with violent crime, but yet we say to ourselves, we'd rather not have it happen because the misidentifications that happen now will never be refined and will never be something that we'll be able to prevent. I think we need to be very careful that we check and double check what we're doing. It's like reviewing my work. If anybody wants to look at, well, why did Chief Fitzgerald assign this type of discipline to this case? Check my work, look it over, say to yourselves, hey, this discipline we thought was a little light or a little over the top, Chief, but check my work because I'm checking my work too. And that's how you keep checks and balances going. You can't be afraid to allow people to check your work, but you also can't be afraid to move on and use things that will help protect this community and that will help take people off the street that are doing very heinous things. Again, I go back to bombing suspects, go to the bombing suspects in England and other places across Europe where people have been identified using the subway systems because of facial recognition technology. I'd say that was worth it. We are thinking in a very short term, and we're thinking that although something maybe hasn't been utilized at its apex right now and is not refined to the level that we'd like to see it, that it's something we should not use. And I think that's a really bad precedent to set.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Grider.
So I appreciate Chief Fitzgerald's points, but I want to make a couple others. I personally, and again, this is just me, don't particularly buy into the argument that if you didn't do anything illegal, you don't have anything to worry about with software that's finding photos of yours that might be private on social media. So that's the first piece that I'd like to bring up. As someone who believes in civil liberties, I think that is somewhat concerning. To Scotland is a nation that's 99.5% white and doesn't deal with these facial recognition softwares. And they do have certain safeguards built into them, both on national Scottish law and on city law. And to the other point about English surveillance, you're right, they have caught people. There are also several court cases in England where this technology didn't work appropriately and people were wrong. And I get that there are multiple layers, but I also get that there are large companies that are using this and saying that this is probably not safe right now. And I don't think that this argument is the same as moving to police cars or other things of that nature, because this isn't data that's collected at a certain point. In some of these cases with some of these software, and obviously that would have to come before the council, this is data that's collected years beforehand, before this person ever did anything, from sites that the person didn't know that they were giving permission for it to do, or in some cases, were not giving permission to do. And so I think this is a conversation that we should have, because yes, I do believe that the technology will happen. I think that we need to be proactive if we do end up adopting it, and that's why I think that we should have these conversations.
So thank you, Mr. Greider. So Chief and Mr. Greider, you mentioned safeguards, right? So I think maybe a part of a larger conversation is maybe coming together, continuing to talk about some of those safeguards.
Absolutely.
Able to take a holistic approach. As the Chief mentioned, that was there also. So I see some room for some conversation, not the elimination, because technology gets better, but we need to make sure we have safeguards in place on the other side, which they may be there, they may not be there, but I believe this is an area where we can at least have some conversation without throwing the entire ability to get to use it out the door. So
I always welcome conversation.
All right. We have number 5 on here, surplus of military grade equipment.
So this is also, and I've been having conversations, so this can certainly change. I am not wedded to this exact language. So again, some concerns were raised to me by individuals about military grade equipment being used by police forces. And again, I think that there are spaces where that can happen. Like I know that we had that unfortunate incident on Hammond and Ridgeway this week where some very large equipment was needed to address this situation. So this is just a starting point. But we also know that policing and the military are different types of things. And I would even change this resolution as is, because this was written a while ago, to talk about if the police did go through the DLA LESO project that to acquire this type of equipment, that we would just, as a council, maybe get a special work session so that we could hear more about that type of stuff. So I would even change the language that we currently have, because there are certainly times when it is helpful, but we also know that we also want to balance that with police are doing a certain thing and the military does a certain thing. And so this was part of that conversation. Like I said, I'm very open to changing it and having a conversation, because there are places where it's helpful and there are places where we should have a critical eye when we make those purchases, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Greider. And because you and I had a conversation, also had a conversation with the chief in some areas where it could be a necessary need. But I think one of the things is taking a look at the actual ordinance that's placed on the council agenda, where it talks about the use of force has to be equal to whatever that situation is. And it also talks about the overproliferation of using it in particular areas disproportionately. So there may be some language, but it would definitely be good to have a conversation with the chief where you can hear some instances where it is used and instances where it absolutely should not be. So thank you for at least wanting to have that conversation. And then number 6, we got about 2 minutes on number 6.
So I will real quick.
Mr. Mayor, I had a question about number 5.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is, what type of military grade equipment do we currently have in the city's possession? What are they?
That we received surplus, Mr. Peterson or Mr. Leibold or Mr. Fitzgerald, what do we currently have from that we received a surplus of military grade equipment?
I just did a quick recap of that. I mean, I know we have some tourniquets and medical equipment, a few rifles, and am I missing something? Anything else? And gas mask. Again, all I'd be willing to go into it a little more and talk about the necessity of certain items that are not necessarily budgeted for, if you'd like, but I will hold off unless I'm asked.
All right.
Mr. Mayor.
Your question? Are you on number 6?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had been told that Waterloo was in receipt of a tank.
What?
That's not true, I hope. I hope that's not true.
We have a Bearcat, and the Bearcat is a shared piece of equipment, correct? The county, a rescue vehicle. I mean, when our SWAT officers are going into an event where there's an active shooter, you would use that vehicle to protect the officers from, let's say, rifle fire and such, which is not, shame to say now, uncommon in cities across the country. So we would want our officers not approaching locations where we know there's somebody actively using a high-powered rifle, which there is a proliferation of high-powered rifles all throughout, our country. It's ultimately for the safety of the officers that are either going in to make an arrest or stop the killing, or they are going in to execute some kind of warrant.
What was Chief Fitzgerald? Was that a item that was received through this military requisition process, or not?
No, that's not.
Oh, okay. So what was fed to me was not correct, I take it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, number 6, really quickly. We got 3 minutes.
Yeah. So real quick, and this was we've discussed, the chief has discussed the use of force on this one. I think the big question, the big concern that people had was the use of tear gas against civilians who are not violent. But we have now in place these other pieces. So that, the concern that was raised to me, and these are questions that I think that we should just have discussions about, is that it's actually not lawful under some international provisions to use tear gas in war. And this was brought up to me by some people. And I said, yes, but also there are provisions that do allow for the use of control in a domestic situation. But we have talked about, and you have alluded to in the ordinance that we are talking about tonight, that there are appropriate responses for appropriate levels. And so I would say that this would be something that has already been addressed in my mind by the other things that we are discussing and discussed last week in the work session in terms of appropriate use of force when force is used against the police at varying levels.
And just, yes, ma'am.
I just think this is an example of not getting our facts straight before we come in here. A simple phone call to the chief would have put the tank theory to rest.
Oh, geez.
And I'd like maybe Chief Fitzgerald to answer the business about the tear gas.
Yeah, and can I add another layer to that? When the tear gas was used, the Courier put up an article that showed protesters on one knee, and up above they say Waterloo Police Department tear gas this crowd. Chief, can you say what happened that night? Because there was a couple different scenarios that happened. And you got 1 minute and 30 seconds.
I'll sum it up real quick. I'll tell you, there's a reporter in the room who was assaulted on the bridge. So there was a call to disperse a crowd that was not peaceful. Any assertion that tear gas was used on a peaceful group of individuals exercising their rights to protest is erroneous. This is a situation where there was not peaceful activity going on. There was an assault going on. There were rock throwing and things like that. I mean, again, police officers nor citizens should be subject to being assaulted, to have rocks thrown at them, to have things set on fire. And when that happens, we're the police department. We are not Seattle. We are not other places like Portland where we allow things to burn. That is not happening.
So Chief, in regards to the conversation from Mr. Grider and the things that are potentially going to be placed in ordinance tonight to support the use of force, I guess it'll be
I can speak to that, Mayor. I mean, I think what you're getting at, and what you want me to hit on here, is that we have protections in place, even in policy, that says we will not kettle, and that is putting a crowd in a situation where they have no exit, all right, and then tear gas a crowd. We won't do those types of things. Those things are, again, against all best practices. We will not do so without the highest ranking supervisor on the scene authorizing it. I mean, we have put into place on paper a real expectation upon our department when we are using force. I go back to talking about a rational decision-making model and using things other than force to get a crowd dispersed or to stop a crowd from rioting. We expect to exhaust all means before we have to, take an action like that. But again, some tools are left best in the toolbox. And because it sounds good, these days to say that the police departments across the country are misusing things, there are more departments across the country that are taking the stand that I'm taking now and saying that if you want your police department to be effective, you'd like crime to be down, you'd like to make sure the business community is satisfied as well as every other community that we have of stakeholders, we need to ensure that we don't let riots happen within our city that tear the city apart and set us back to 1968. We will preserve everyone's rights as police officers. That is our jobs. But the last thing we want to do is have to disperse a crowd using force. If we do so, however, we're willing to stand it up and we're willing to tell you why we did it and to hope and to expect that the council would listen to us, listen to our argument, and if they need to be critical of that argument, do so. But also be armed with all the information necessary beforehand to say to us, what happened there, and can you give us some type of explanation before bringing it? And it's your right, sir. You said it several times. Several councilmen have said this so far. It's your right as a policy-making body to make and create policy, but be careful that you're not creating or making policy that puts your stakeholders in jeopardy.
So a direct correlation is to Mr. Greider's point. You have worked to put a policy in place that makes sure that unless the amount of force, the amount of force is equal.
What you're looking for is proportionate, and we did. I definitely put in the first time I had an opportunity to present and bring some of the documentation to council to describe what changes were made. Part of that was use of force changes, and the use of force changes, and the significant part was rational decision making, using force that is proportionate, the expectation leveled upon police officers to stop unnecessary force being used upon anyone, the duty to intervene. All of the buzzwords that are out there now were explained within the packet that was provided to the city council during that session about a month and a half ago, when I explained some of the things that were already on the agenda or had already taken place within the police department as far as policy changes are concerned.
I think it's good to understand that how this ties in to that so that council members can understand it. So I appreciate the conversation. It is 5:19, 5:20. We have a finance meeting, and then we have a very packed council meeting, I would assume, and I need to get upstairs.
Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Morrissey.
I had one question, and that is that this resolution, number 6, in my understanding of it, was the use of lethal force by the Waterloo Police Department against peaceful protesters. Is there any thinking that there's justification to use tear gas, rubber bullets against peaceful protesters?
Within that policy that specifically prohibits, the policy that was provided about a month and a half or so ago specifically states that if people are protesting peacefully, you shall not or will not use tear gas and other items against a peaceful crowd.
And that is on the ordinance this evening, not to use that type of force. if it doesn't call for it. That's what I'm trying to explain. But Mrs. Jewin, you want to close us out and get to finance?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion been made with second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Adjourned.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Waterloo City Council Finance Committee. Madam Clerk, please read the roll.
Mr. Morrissey?
Yes.
Mrs. Klein?
Here.
Mrs. Jewin?
Here. Motion to approve agenda and minutes, please.
Motion to approve the agenda in the minutes of August 17th, 2020 as proposed.
Second.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry,
everybody.
was there a second?
Everybody.
I seconded it.
Thank you.
Excuse me, everybody. Can you please hold it down? We're trying to hold a finance committee meeting.
Get through this meeting.
Excuse me, everybody. Can you please hold it down? We're trying to get through a finance committee meeting. Thank you very much.
Real quick.
We'll be fast.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the agenda and minutes and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right.
Opposed? Motion carries. Would someone take travel requests?
Madam Chair, the first travel request is Luke Even, Philip Thompson, Glenn Bierbauer, Robert Thompson, Forestry Department, class meeting, rigging for arboriculture workshop. Destination Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Date September 17th, 2020, in an amount not to exceed $458. The second is Officer John Coons. It's a class meeting, Defensive Tactics Instructor School. It's in Des Moines, Iowa, September 24th through the 28th, 2020, in an amount not to exceed $1,020.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right.
Opposed? Motion carries. Before we get to pre-authorization, is Michelle Wiedner on the phone?
Yes.
When did the pre-authorization, when was that scheduled to change to 2,500?
I think next meeting, but I don't know when. This is hardwired into this agenda, so I'm not sure when we can get this fixed. But
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that. So thank you. Would someone take the pre-authorizations, please?
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Morrissey.
Motion to approve the following pre-authorizations over $1,000. Number 3 is building maintenance with the amount and estimated shipping and handling, $36,125 for emergency repairs for the JACE control.
Please, we need silence in here while we're trying to do the finance committee. It's difficult to hear. Thank you.
For the JACE control replacements at the library and the city hall. Next is building maintenance with the amount and estimated shipping and handling, $35,890 for replacement of 9 overhead doors, openers, and tracks for fire station number 1. The next one is amount and estimated shipping and handling for the finance department of $3,000 for actuarial services to prepare annual form 509A with the state of Iowa. Next is the garage. Mountain estimated shipping and handling, $2,634.57 for a high-lift dual wheel dolly. Next is the leisure services with the mountain estimated shipping and handling, $2,695 for 8 double-row studded ice tires for 2 Zambonis at the Young Arena. Next is the mayor with the mountain estimated shipping and handling of $34,887.06 for the fiscal year 2021 intercog dues. Next is the MIS department with the amount and estimated shipping and handling, $3,850 for an Avaya IPO SIP trunk licenses for city phone system. Next is planning and zoning with the amount and estimated shipping and handling of $1,200 for appraisal services for Lot 5 at West Airline Highway. Next is the sewer department with the amount and estimated shipping and handling $9,560 for the U.S. Department of Interior U.S. Geological Annual Agreement. And finally is the street department with the amount and estimated shipping and handling $4,795 for a John Deere 624 bucket.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right.
Opposed? Motion carries. I'll take the budget line items to be amended. Motion to approve the project budget for the Leversey Road Sanitary and Water Main Improvements Project funded with $263,005 in tax increment finance revenue and $663,429.50 in funds from Waterworks as submitted by the engineering department.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor say aye.
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 Thank you. Michelle, I'm sorry, I haven't gotten the bills payment sheet yet. Can you give me that dollar amount, please?
Yes, $3,190,946.59. That's 3,190,946.59.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, then I'll make a motion as in the bills payment dated August 24th, 2020, to receive, place, and file, and forward to the full council in the amount of $3,190,946.59.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carries.
Motion to adjourn. Second.
Second.
We have two motions, 2 seconds. All in favor, say aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you.